George Floyd, someone's got to explain this to me. We've talked about it in previous vlogs. My understanding in Canadian criminal law, you can go after first-degree murder, and if you don't get that, you can get the lesser and included charges.
Yep.
How do they decide between third-degree murder, second-degree murder, and not going after first-degree, at the very least for Chauvin?
The reason is because felony murder is easy. It's the same reason why they're doing it in the Arbery case. So in second-degree murder in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, under Minnesota state law, is just felony murder. Well, there's other aspects too. It could be something other than felony murder, but they're pursuing a felony murder case. So they realize to bring in the other people. Here's the problem. If they go after Chauvin for intentional murder, it's very hard to go after the others for felony murder because they're trying to claim all of these guys are committing a felony, which result in the murder. And so for them, they want the other people held as responsible as Chauvin. If they go in and say, you know what, Chauvin is just a complete ass and he deliberately murdered the guy.
The other three get off.
Correct, or at least more likely to. Theoretically, they could still be held responsible, but then there becomes a disconnect in the causative chain.
So, I mean, that's interesting. So if they go after murder one for Chauvin and they say, okay, it was premeditated, but none of the other three knew that it was premeditated. At some point, they get wise to what's going on. But if they go and try to prove that against Chauvin, then it lets the other three off. Whereas if they go with second degree, they can still get all the other three on felony murder because they contributed to the felonious act.
Yep.
Okay, that's a very interesting explanation because I watching it, I say, okay, for first degree murder, it's got to be premeditated. We all appreciate that. Did Chauvin wake up that morning saying he was going to go kill George Floyd in particular? Probably not. But in my mind, I'm thinking after 2 minutes of what he's doing, he knows what he's doing. So if that's not premeditation, or if it doesn't become premeditation about 2 minutes into what he knows what he's doing, why not? So I guess the argument is it could have been, but they decided strategically not to, so they can go after the other three for felony murder charges.
It's definitely if I was defending the other cops, I might be inclined to pursue an intentional murder theory against Chauvin as almost a defense. I would say it'd be like I would say, look, they thought he was in control, didn't realize he had this nefarious intent. They didn't realize. I mean, my argument, there's some people wanting to defend Chauvin. Chauvin fits the definition of what I've talked about earlier in this on our prior live streams. If you want to see a civil rights case and you want to know whether the cop trying to figure out what was in the cop's head, look at the cop's history. Bad cops have a long history. There's been a lot of surveys and studies on this, but I've done it on my own cases. Same as domestic violence cases, right? If you're trying to figure out whether he said, she said, well, just look at the guy's history, or in some cases her history, but more often the guy's. And if the guy has a history of women saying the same thing about him, then he did it again in all likelihood. By contrast, if every other woman he's ever been with says that didn't happen, by the way, hint, hint, that's the O.J. Simpson case, then maybe it didn't quite happen the way people are saying it happened. So in this case, this guy had 18 prior complaints against him, 18, almost 6 problematic shootings he had been involved in. The reason why he was on the street as long as he was is because the would-be vice president of the United States, the New York Times recommended president of the United States, the current senator from the state of Minnesota, Amy Klobuchar, kept him in power, kept that officer in power, kept him from being prosecuted, kept him from being disciplined. It's my theory as to part of the reason why these riots occurred, and to some degree. The media and the Democratic Party could not afford the Floyd case to get into detail about how that happened. Because the number one reason is a bad cop was kept on the street long after they had every reason to know he was a deeply troubled individual. The other cops too, by the way, also bad histories, beating up guys with pregnant women, all kinds of crazy stuff. But the Chauvin, horrid history, one of the worst rap sheets any cop could have, no business being on the streets. And yet the only reason he was is because Klobuchar kept him there. Now, when that's the person that Biden is considering for vice president, when that's the person the New York Times said should be president of the United States, that doesn't surprise me that all of a sudden there's a shift in the agenda to not get into details about George Floyd's case.
So help me understand that, because it's the first time I've heard that. And when people say, when my reflex is when people try to blame something on a politician, there has to be some specific knowledge, not just the general knowledge of managing the police force. Did she have some specific knowledge of this problematic cop in particular?
Oh, yes. Chauvin was people wanted him prosecuted for a shooting in which he and 3 other officers put 43 holes into the guy in his vehicle within about a 15-second span. And there was a lot of reason. And by that point, Chauvin already had prior police complaints against him for abuse and misconduct. So the local NAACP wanted Klobuchar, when she was prosecutor, to prosecute him. She reviewed the case and she said, no prosecution. I don't find he did anything wrong. I'm not even going to refer him to discipline. The number one reason we have abusive police in the United States is because prosecutors cover for them and police departments cover for them. It's by far, whenever I've had a case of a bad cop doing something crazy, there will have always been, in fact, there hasn't been a single instance where that hasn't been the case yet, any case I've ever had. There has always been a record, always been a history of complaints. These guys are usually complained about within a year on the job because they're the sociopaths who seek out police work. I always say it's not the police's fault that the nature of their work invites sociopaths to apply, but it's a reality that they need to deal with if they're going to police the police. But the number one reason, I bring these cases to the attention of prosecutors right away. I bring them to the attention of police departments right away. Now, in a place like Chattanooga, where I have a lot of political friends and allies, my hometown in Tennessee, I can get people to do something. But in most other places, they don't care. And in fact, usually they'll go to great lengths to cover it up.
Okay. So, I actually want to ask you why, but I want to just get these three super chats because one of them I think you'll be able to answer. What defenses would you say that Chauvin and the other cops have in the Floyd case? Do you think Floyd's family is having having Crump as an attorney hurts them? We'll get to that in a second, because I think for Chauvin, I think you've made it clear what defenses he doesn't have, but for the others, it's sort of implied what defenses they might have. Can the jury in the Floyd case bring back a higher charge after a guilty finding? They can't find a charge guiltier than that for which he was charged, right?
Nope, Ed. That's either the grand jury or by criminal complaint after preliminary hearing, depending on the process. But it's considered a deviation from the indictment, and you're not allowed to do that. So you're only allowed to convict on that which either a grand jury or court has passed on and has already decided has probable cause of.
Okay, and now this, I've been getting a lot of questions, and I think SSG Lesser asked me yesterday and sent me an email. We're gonna discuss the similarities or the dissimilarities with the Tony Timpa case. So I'll get to that. Someone remind me if I don't get to it. And then we got, will Chauvin et al. Personnel files be admissible? This is going to go hand in hand with the next question. Why would a prosecutor cover for the cops? Is it because they want to avoid bad publicity? It costs too much to get them off. The union defends the cops. Why? What is the incentive not to do this reflexively?
It's all of the above, but primarily, well, I'll give you the non-conspiratorial version, then give you the conspiratorial version. The non-conspiratorial version is that the institutional nature of being a prosecutor is you're not self-reflective. You instinctively defend any police because you see them as on your team, on your side, so that you see any accusation against them as one against your own family or a close partner. And so you defend them accordingly, reflexively, and with a knee-jerk reaction, and you look for every excuse possible. And unless there's overwhelming evidence that they're guilty, you're not going to bring the prosecution. Conspiratorial version would be that the political classes that be want some bad cops because bad cops are useful in the way mobs are useful. That sometimes you want a bad cop to break some knees, break some elbows, break some arms. You want that to go in and handle the tough crowd, quote unquote. A lot of your bad cops are like Mark Furman. They have records of high rates of conviction, high rates of investigation, high rates of taking a case from being an open file to being a closed file. They usually know how to play the game. So that's the more conspiratorial version. The best show on this that I recommend for anybody to understand policing in America, particularly in urban centers, is watch The Wire. It's about 5-season episodes. It also gets into the media and the rest, but it's fantastic. And it captures the mindset of how even innocent cops can lose it. Now, as to what the defenses are, I can imagine the narrative for Chauvin in the Floyd case and the other officers. I think there's separate narratives. But for him, it's going to be, hey, I showed up. This guy's acting crazy. He won't behave. We try to put him in the back of the car. He's screaming and pushing and trying to punch and everything else. We couldn't do anything to control him. So we just get him on the ground and just try to stay on him because the moment we relax, he would go crazy again. And he'll probably do a long version of, I've been through this a lot. And this one time, this guy grabbed the knife. And this other time, this guy was able to grab a gun, etc. It's, good luck with that. The problem, there's parts of that are true, but here's the main counter. Floyd is the way to reform in Floyd's case is simple. aside from not having bad cops on the force when you know they're bad cops. The second is, for a long time, a lot of the suits I've been bringing, we need to incorporate better mental and medical health in our response, and we need to not burden police with being mental and medical health professionals. Now, as Brandon Tatum, co-founder of Blexit, but he also was a great football player back in the day. He was actually a police officer for a while in Texas for a long time. And he explained right away, he said, look, as a police officer, we were trained in excited delirium and other things that like it. He's like, you show up, Floyd, like this is my main argument to other people. Clearly they knew Floyd was behaving irrationally and needed mental health from the time of the 911 call, because the 911 calls, they're not calling in because they're really bothered by $20 in counterfeit cash or the cigarettes going out. They're bothered because they're saying something's wrong with this guy. He came back and he did this and he's just sitting in the car and there's something wrong with him. So they're recognizing a mental health problem. And when the police show up, you have to really know it's a mental health problem because he's still there. He hasn't fled. He hasn't left. He's still acting weird and he's still there knowing the police were called. So at that point, you had to know, and I guarantee you some of those officers, I know they've been likely trained in excited delirium, which is a state that happens when you may be experiencing a kind of overdose effect of things like fentanyl, of things like meth, of other drugs you can be on, where you're going through an excited stage. If people Google it, excited delirium, you'll see a lot of Floyd's behavior. So they know that Floyd's behavior is not criminally resisting arrest. This is someone who's having mental problems, who's behaving in a counterproductive, irrational manner. And I'm sure to some degree Chauvin knew that. Chauvin was one of those cops, in my view, who liked being a cop because he liked being the boss. And that's what people saw in that just short visual.
No, when he stares up and stares at the car and says, I'm doing this and there's nothing anybody can do to stop me.
Exactly. It's why it was so inflammatory. The white guy with his knee on the neck of the black man showing he doesn't give a damn is the way he's responding to the people. And I have no doubt that's who that guy is. And so that's where but the big mistake, the reason why he doesn't have much of a defense is because he's been trained to recognize excited delirium. He's been trained to involve a medical health response in that circumstance and situation. He's been trained to know the difference. I mean, I brought one of these cases in Wisconsin. A guy committed armed robbery. It was not the worst kind of armed robbery. Basically went with his buddy. His buddy insisted that the ex had stuff that was really his, domestic dispute situation. Turned out not to really be his, but that kind of dynamic. And my guy was a relatively, as criminals go, not too mean a guy. He confessed right away. Police pulled him over. He's like, yeah, screwed up. My buddy there was wrong. But he was an epileptic. He gets taken into the jail. He tells them, I haven't had my shot or any epilepsy treatment in almost a day, which was already a problem. Of course, they do nothing about it. And then he starts experiencing seizures, banging his head against the floor, starts urinating on himself, defecating on himself. Well, the geniuses at the Milwaukee County jail system decided that meant he was resisting arrest because he just wanted to make them smell his self-defecation and self-urination. And so they basically picked him up and treated him like a garbage bag, and how they walked him around the jail, took him over to the hospital, then got him right out of the hospital. He started experiencing conditions all over again, treated him even worse all the way back, ended up dead. Brought the case, and when you go through it, you find out they're all trained on this stuff to recognize the big difference between a mental health issue and a criminal resistance issue. Now, here would be the best defense for the cops. They do experience people who fake medical conditions as a way to try to resist arrest. But there are clear, easy ways to distinguish it. And just the fact that Floyd when you have the 911 call plus Floyd is still there when he knew they called the police, by my understanding, then the guy is behaving in a manner that's a mental health issue, that's likely a drug overdose issue. So your obligation at that point, protect and serve, is to get immediate medical health treatment. And instead, they beat him up and killed him. So I don't think they're going to win their defense.
Well, and this actually is going to lead into the next question. Before I get there, does the police union have to play a role in the defense of the officers? I think the answer is yes. Mm-hmm. Sir, how good is the shield for realism?
Mm-hmm. Extremely good. Extremely good.
Okay, so here's my question. I mean, my imagining is that the only defense that might exist for Chauvin is Floyd died of something totally unrelated, purely spontaneous, and just bad coincidence that it happened when he had his knee on his neck for 9 minutes. And I say, good luck with that. The question now is, though, and I know people are asking this, the police autopsy comes out and confirms that the death was not asphyxiation or strangulation. Whether or not you believe that, does that weaken the prosecution's case?
Two different components. I mean, in terms of the autopsy still also concluded that they believe they could not rule out that part of the cause of his heart attack was the restraint, him being put under restraints, and the whole condition that was happening to him. So they'll be able to get past that issue. That's why they also charge felony murder, because that makes the whole incident part of why he dies. And they can't, even the autopsy doesn't rule that out. It says the combination of his drug condition and the nature of his restraints and the police conduct, they don't know which cause. It's like a true cause of death rather than our COVID-19 causes of death. Normally there's 3 or 4 possible causes, but that will be sufficient for them in front of the jury. Their biggest, and that'll be part of the defense, I'm sure. But the real part of the defense will be a moral undercurrent, which will be, hey, this guy was a dangerous criminal who was behaving like a crazed man on drugs, who they were just trying to control and wanting it to all be calm. Their main defense won't really be that defense, so that will be the one in court. Their main defense will be all the riots that are happening. So because that case I just talked about that I had in Milwaukee, had to settle the case before it reached the jury because I realized the jury was going to vote 12-0 against me. Because even though they saw horrific video evidence 10 times as bad as Floyd's, they were still going to walk because they have been convinced in their heads that all of the black BLM narratives are all bogus and false, because they've seen a lot of them turn out bogus and false. It's my view. I'm extremely negative towards BLM because they've made my job in civil rights harder, and I've seen it and lived it in cases all across the country. So that's their biggest risk. The biggest risk is jury selection of a jury that, especially in light of Floyd's name being connected to riots and all the looting taking place, says, you know what, down deep, I kind of want that cop on that wall to be, Jack Nicholson, A Few Good Men. Yeah, maybe he's a little rough. Yeah, maybe he's a little mean, but this was a bad guy anyway. And because they were going to do it in my case, in which they had far less reason to do so. And and some of the people knew me on the jury pool were like, hey, I really like you, so on and so forth. Well, why did you follow the case? But, the nature of the animal. But I noticed it midway through because of how they were responding to the most horrifying video that I had tested with focus groups and got 90% positive, for our side of the aisle responses. People were just outraged when they would see the video. The way they just dropped him when he was going to be dead about 2 minutes later. Treated him literally like a garbage bag, filled with the worst garbage in it. And so if that could happen in Milwaukee, Minneapolis, not a lot different. Now you add all of the violence. But what I got a backlash to BLM. I got jurors around there like, I'm not going to convict no matter what. I'm not, and that was just a civil case. They didn't even have to find criminal responsibility. They were like, I'm not going to give them a penny, because these are all a bunch of fraudsters and scam artists who just want to divide everybody, who push bogus cases and fake narratives. And I'm not going to buy anything. Even if I like the lawyer involved, I'm just not going to buy it. He's just, he's caught up as part of this case. I'm going to make a statement. And the other statement will be a thin blue line. People should watch the documentary, A Thin Blue Line. It's about how that was abused. To go back to your earlier question about why prosecutors would do this, well, there was a phrase back in Houston, Texas, talked about in that documentary, Thin Blue Line, where they railroaded an innocent guy. That's where the line came from. The prosecutor said, this is a thin blue line, and he used it to inflame the jury to convict an innocent man. But they used to say in Harris County, and the prosecutors there, they used to say any prosecutor can convict a guilty man. It takes an exceptional prosecutor to convict an innocent one. And it was their joke. That gives you an idea of the mindset of some of these folks. So unfortunately, there's going to be a backlash coming. Every case like this is why Arbery has the McMichaels have a chance to walk. Even Chauvin has a chance to walk. They all have a chance to walk, because if it happens, it'll be because a bad jury was selected that's in a backlash mindset because of what happened, because of the riots and the looting.
Very interesting.